the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute, Teachings of Plasma Science. We are embarking on the Intermediate Insight series. And this is the first class.
Estamos en las enseñanzas intermedias. ¿Aló?
Yes,
Hola, Liliana.
I'm going to have to
Para-
mute you, Alenka. Your mic is open. Can I mute you, please?
Yes, I'm
Thank you. No problem.
so this is the first class of the Intermediate Insight series. It's called Default. And my name is Alexander. I'm from Canada. It is March 20th, 2022. This is the Kesh Foundation North American Plasma Education Series. And so it does include Canada, the US, and Mexico. That's part of the North American team. But as you can see, we have representation from all 6 continents. And so this becomes quite an international event. And it's not just for those who are present. It's for those who will be listening in the future. There are certain conflicts today. And so one of those is that it's a new year in the Iranian community. And so there's a preoccupation with that. And there are other people who have other preoccupations, and that's what we want to discuss today. Because for some people, it's a new year. For some people, it's a happy new year. And it's for some people, I don't have time to talk about that. So all of us have a connection, and that connection is our default. And can we make that connection? So that's what we're going to talk about today. But I want to make sure that new students understand that this is a continuation of a process on a journey that I started a long time ago. And I've had an opportunity to put it together in some semblance of order. And so in October of 2020, we began the basic teachings. And so, of course, we had intermediate and advanced teaching. And then we progressed to basic understanding, and then progressed to basic knowing. And last week, we finished basic insight. So as you can see, we're looking to go a little bit forward to add to the knowledge. And we are now in the intermediate level of the teaching. So is this only for the mature students? No, it is for the new students as well. Because when we look at how many of us are knowledge seekers, and we're talking about actively, it's a very, very small percentage. And so this is a growing phenomenon. And there is a reason that it's growing, which is why we're going to talk about this today. And so what you can see is that there's a progression through this intermediate level, which is adding to and concluding with the harvest of this knowledge. Because really, that's what we're trying to do here on this planet. We're trying to stay alive, and the purpose of living is to learn. And we have other considerations. So one of those considerations is to break into the new era. So we've set a date, June the 6th, 2022, the launch to the moon. And we are in that countdown. And as they say, it's T minus 77 days. It's T minus 77 days and counting. And there are many questions as to how we are going to do that. I'd like to just say that please rest assured that the future is in the past tense, and you shall see what that means, because there is a connection. And so we want to talk about that connection. So you understand that when we mess things up, which is almost always, we have this option. And so let's say it's your phone, or let's say it's your computer, or let's say it's a system that you've been working on and for some reason it's all messed up. We have an option to reset to the factory settings. And the reason we reset to these factory settings is because the factory built the system. And so the factory had an intention to make sure that that system was working. And it made settings that ensured that that would work. But it also gave us the opportunity to modify those settings. But we are not trained by the factory, and we are bringing in other factors to set these settings. And so we may make mistakes, and these mistakes could actually be very disruptive to the system. So it's nice to have this fallback position to be able to reset to the factory settings. And it is these factory settings which we call the default settings. So this fallback position is not always guaranteed because we still have the choices. And so there's a fault in this default system. And that fault lies in the fact that there is an original feeding system. So the original feeding system, we could say, is the original factory setting. And the choice that we have is to offer a feedback to the original feeding. And so that becomes the feedback system. And that feedback system becomes, or the decision is created through the success or failure of that feedback system. So if that feedback system, for instance, is failing, we can make an adjustment. And if we don't have the knowledge on how to overcome that failing, then we would reset to the factory default. However, we can also choose to adjust a feedback system that would cater to our wishes. And this may diverge from the original factory settings. And the decision as to whether this is good or not is depending on the point of view. And so when we look at how we fit in with the rest of the universe, and we've discussed this many, many times because it involves the basic 3 books that Mr. Kesh has been providing. So book number 1 is the universal order of creation. And the creation of what? And so generically speaking, it's the creation of matters. Okay, so is the universe a matter? Well, yeah, it is a matter, and it originated from somewhere as well. So if the matters originated from the universe, and the universe originated from something, then really book number 3 should be book number 1. And so maybe we've got things backwards. And interestingly enough, is when we go into outer space, we don't even have to worry if it's right side up. It could very easily be upside down, so that doesn't matter either. But now we have another problem, and that is that there's a lot of things out there that we can't see. And so you could say, well, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. Well, yeah, that there's a lot of truth to that. But is it? Is it out of mind? Because let's face it, the mind is also not visible. So we're talking about tangibilities. And then when we look at the relationship of these tangibilities, then we see that our universe is tiny. That little red dot in the bottom right-hand corner, that's our little tiny planet. And that little tiny planet is only tiny because if we compare it to the rest of the universe. And if we ignore the rest of the universe because, it's hard to see, then our Earth becomes very large. And so our position in that earthbound state is very small. And it could be almost insignificant. But it is significant because it is in an earthbound state. And the earthbound state is within man's universe. And man's universe is within the universe. And there is a link. And that link is also not visible. And so that link is also out of sight and therefore out of mind. And so what we're saying now is that there has to be a connection to the default position of the universe. There's a source, and we are connected to that source. We're also connected to our earthbound state. So in fact, the question comes, which direction does our source come from? And how is it exactly that we are linked? And so we came to the conclusion last week that there's an inside with respect to our earthbound state, and there's an outside with respect to our earthbound state. And that there is a connection, which we call a dynamic plasma. So that dynamic plasma, when it comes from within, is the feeding system. And when it goes out, it has to come back. And so that becomes the feedback system. And those are not the only two options. So what we're going to talk about today is the feeding system. What is it that's inside? And how does it move around? So when we look at the various limitations that we have, if we only look at what we can see, and if it's the first time you're looking at this panel, it seems very confusing, I guess. But we've been building it up over the last 2 years. And so what we're trying to identify is the soul limitations, because what we want to do is transcend the soul limitations. So we have focused a lot on the physicality. And so we know that there's a physical body and there's obviously a brain in our body, and that too is physical. But this is what grounds us or anchors us to this planet. And we find that there is a conflict, because now we realize there's a tugging as a pulling, a tugging from another direction. And so that tugging is also coming from another anchor. And so the anchor that is pulling us, whether it is pulling us from the soul direction or whether it's pulling us from the physical direction, is pulling us. And that is what we feel. And you can understand that because it's a lot easier to pull on an anchor, to pull on a chain, or to pull on a rope. Try it sometime. See if you can push a rope. See if you can push a string. And see how effective you'd be. So the dominating effect is the pulling. And it pulls us one way or the other way. And so we have emotions which are pulling us. And they manifest in a physical movement. And so these emotions that we've been able to identify is the divergence of the emotion of presence. In other words, the emotion of presence is a combination of the emotion of past and the emotion of the future. Doesn't that make sense? So we look at our future based on our past, but there's no rule that says that that has to be, because the emotion of presence is the learning total that we get from the emotion of the past. And with that learning comes an awareness. And with that awareness, we go through this transformation. And because we are all independent, so then the question comes is, how could we be independent if we all come from the same source? And so the reason for that is because there's an interaction. And it is this interaction, which we call inertia. And this is related to this planet. So this inertia is the interaction of plasma fields between the sun and the earth. And so we see that, well, the sun is feeding us. And so as a result of the sun feeding us, the earth is giving a feedback. And this is good because we walk on the earth and we look up to the sun. So we are well anchored. We are well anchored in our emotion of presence. And we can operate calmly in that emotion of presence because we have a trust. Where did that trust come from? And so when we look at the way we were born, we find that we obviously came. We can't remember where we came from. So we have to learn by connection. And we know that when we came, we had a trust. Trust in the sun, trust in the earth, trust in the father, trust in the mother, and trust in the womb, and trust in the welcoming into our present condition. Do we still have that trust in adulthood? Because the trust that we came with was the feeding system. And the trust that we have now is the feedback system. And how effective is this feedback system? And so many of us are now going through a lot of emotional tugging because we're having difficulty in understanding or discerning which one is the feeding system and which one is the feedback system. And why is this important? And it is important because the trust that you arrived with here was the default factory setting. And the factory is the home of the creator, and you are the product. So you are a product of that default factory setting. And so the continuation is open for you to decide how you're going to feedback to that. And so this is the beauty of the life, is that you have this free will. Well, how free is it? How free is your independence when your freedom is dependent on others who are likewise independent? And if those whom you are dependent on are undependable, then your independence is dependent on undependability. What kind of feedback system is that? And so when we look at our situation, we see that we have a situation on this planet where we are morally, socially, and financially bankrupt. And so that's very good, because that's the feedback that we have. And what that feedback is telling us in the most obvious way is that we need to reset to the default position. Well, we have another problem, and that is a conditional feedback. And this conditional feedback is based on double talk. So where words have double meanings, and as such, then they have double understanding. How can you differentiate between the feeding system or the feedback system, especially when the feedback system which you depend on is limited? And so if you only depend on these feedback systems, this impacts your soul. And so these are the soul limitations. Let me give you an example. I brought up a personal situation that I ran into a while ago, and I'll repeat it again because it kind of demonstrates what the default position is. My friend had a 6-car garage. It was a beautiful home, beautiful garage, and he had 6 cars. None of these cars was under $80,000. In fact, that was the cheapest car. So the estimated value of these 6 cars would be over $600,000. So that 6-car garage in estimated value for me would have been like 20 cars. I like driving expensive cars, but there are limitations on where you can go. And then, of course, there's the cost of the repairs. So expensive cars are more expensive to repair than cheap cars. In fact, sometimes the cost of the repair is more than the cost of a cheap car. And he was pointing out these cars to me because he was trying to impress me. And I'm looking at it and I said, well, you know what? If I had a car and I only need 1 car, or maybe I would have the luxury of a 2nd car in case the first car would have to be repaired. So I'd still have access to a car. But what do I need the other 18 cars for? And unless you're a collector, I guess. But the thing is that all of these cars were internal combustion vehicles. So there was no innovation, there was no novelty. They were all regular cars that you can get from a regular car dealer, and they were all purchased with money. And money is something that all of us have an opportunity to make. I'm not saying how much money or, how successful we are. I'm just saying that all of us can make money. And those who make more money can afford more expensive vehicles. But like I say, they were all internal combustion vehicles, and they were all bought with money that any average person could make. So if I say I'm an average person and I make money and I make enough money to buy this vehicle, then I would have the same vehicle that he has. So why would I be impressed? The fact of the matter is, I'd be more impressed if he had a 6-car stable like this. And as silly as this looks, the whole concept of being impressed with his possessions, his physical possessions, which are all based on money, there's no novelty, there's no humor, there's nothing really to be impressed about. And okay, well, that's fine. But why does he want to impress me? And why is it important to him to impress me? Because I'm a nobody. So why does he want to impress me? And in fact, let's go one step further. Why does he need to impress anybody? Except maybe he needs to impress himself. And so that brings us to another story. And that is to figure out what is it that's really important. And I've said, if important is not important, then really nothing is important. And so we find that when we're defining plasma, that the plasma is an energy state. And it transcends the limitations of science. Well, isn't that important? Isn't that important to know? And so we find in today's environment that we have things that are occupying our minds. And we find that we are literally going into uncharted skies. And so you forgive me if I, as a teacher, am becoming a student, because I'm trying to figure out who do I follow and who do I learn from? And so the answer always boils down to you have to follow the moral leader. Okay, because the moral leader caters to your default position. But your default position, if it's only based on what you can hear or what you can see, and in that regard, that affects your belief system, well, we find that our default system is giving us an option. Our default system is giving us a new positioning. And so we have a physicality and we have a trust and a source of this trust. The source of the trust is the default positioning. Our physicality is our target. But our understanding is the way that we can navigate these uncharted skies. And so we have to sort it out. And we say, well, we have to get elevated. And so we see, well, there's a connection to the plasma science, but there's also connection to the soul of the sun. And actually, there's a connection even beyond. And so what we find is that if we can tune in to all of this and turn on to the energy of the universe, what we have to do is drop out of our physical limitation. And as we say, there is a rough road ahead. Well, why is there a rough road ahead? Well, it's spring. And so you all know that with spring, potholes spring up, potholes in our roads. And so from our basic science, we know that things gravitate based on density. And we know that there is a competition here between the density of the asphalt, the density of the air, and the density of the water. And so we can clearly see that there's water in the pothole. So as students, let's all learn how to be engineers. And we see that, well, if the water doesn't have anywhere to flow, then it has to stay there. And how did the water get in there in the first place? So what you have to realize is that the asphalt is the road surface. But there may be air gaps underneath the asphalt. And what we do know is that that water is not going anywhere. So therefore, if the water gets an opportunity to displace the air gap underneath the asphalt, then now we have water underneath the asphalt. And we know, because of the universal solvent characteristic of water, that water, unlike other elements, expands when it freezes. It's a unique characteristic. And so when it expands, of course, it creates ice, which pumps up the asphalt. And because the asphalt is rigid, it doesn't have the flexibility. So when a car drives over it, it breaks the asphalt. Well, this is a natural process. So this is a natural feeding system where we have a natural product like a road, a natural air, natural water. And when we bring these into combination through the changes of the season, the changes of the season are the feedback system. And our adaptation to this changing of the seasons is measured by how we understand this road to be engineered. And clearly, and this is not unique to wherever this is in England, but this is not unique to England, it's everywhere. We have potholes everywhere. And so how do we deal with this? Because it's important. Well, here comes the pothole fixer. A white knight, shining. And so we need a conditional feeding system, right? Because the conditional feedback system is not working. The potholes need to be fixed. And so this shining white knight is offering to correct the situation. So he's feeding into the system, and he can do this. Well, he can do this because he has the money to do this. So if you don't have the money to do this, then you can't organize this, because there's quite an expense to this. And funny enough, there's a feedback to this feedback, insofar as there are complaints that the feeding to this system is actually a problem. Well, why would there be a problem associated with this? And that is because there's a limitation on this feedback, you see.
Alex, could you please go back to the previous?
Okay, Alenka. So
Thank you. I had too much noise here. I couldn't hear.
okay, so let me just review. Please bear with me on this.
He asked if you could go back to the previous slide, I think.
Oh, the previous slide?
That's what I thought she said.
Well, the previous slide had to do with a natural feeding system, which is the creation of the pothole.
I'm going to mute her.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the shining knight, the white knight, who's now going to feed into this system, is going to fix these potholes. And so that will be the feedback. You will get a fixed pothole. But as a result of this feedback, there's another feedback which was complaining that he was doing this. And the reason that he was doing this was because he had the money to do this and because he needed to do this. But you see, there were limitations on the feedback. And so what I want to do is to address the other conditions of this feedback system. And so from the shining white knight's perspective, he wants to drive his Ferrari on a proper road. And the potholes were damaging his suspension system. So we could discuss that if he were to purchase a cheaper car, like one of the ones that I would purchase, he could literally drive that on these potholes until the potholes get fixed. But he insists on driving the expensive car. So really, the reason that he was fixing this road was not for me and my cheap car, but for him and his expensive car. And of course, the engineer is upset because what does he know about fixing the roads? He's an entertainer. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to fix the road, but that's never mind. The thing is that this now is a journalistic commentary. And this class is not a commentary. This is a class is for educational purposes. I'm not trying to make a comment here, except that this journalist has decided that the story is that this white knight has offered to donate his time and money to fixing the roads for the benefit of everybody. But when you see the complaints that come out, then he is not a pothole fixer, he's really a whistleblower. And who are we blowing the whistle on? Well, this is the thing. The person who is responsible for this is scot-free. In other words, there's no discussion. You see, because the community pays for the maintenance of this road, and there is a provision for someone to take care of the maintenance of this road. And that person is derelict in their duty. And the journalist had an opportunity to expose this. And so the journalist is derelict in his duty. And the engineer had an opportunity to design the road as per the natural feeding system. And he's derelict in his duty. And the whistleblower did not blow the whistle on those who are derelict in their duty. So even the whistleblower is derelict in his duty. And this is the feedback that we get. And the best way that we can summarize this feedback is entertainment. It's entertaining to see the interaction of these feedback systems. The tragedy is that this is part of the mainstream news. And on this mainstream news, there are different things of different importance. So we know that we have wars. We know that we have conflicts. We know that we have, shall we say, harshness in our survivability. And we know that we have existential crises. This story is competing with all of those. That's ridiculous. Don't you think that that's ridiculous? That all of these stories carry the same weight? What is going on? As plasma knowledge seekers, you understand that the main story is how we can overcome our soul limitations with the plasma science, which nobody talks about because we're preoccupied with potholes, which verify and validate our existence. But when it's out of balance, then we have a confirmation. But when it's in balance, then it's completely invisible. So the visibility is not necessarily dependent on the balancing. Plasmatically speaking, yes. But if you limit the feedback, then you can make anything disappear. And so we are at this vanishing point where we have a real vanishing point, the plasma science, or we have a contrived vanishing point, which is ignoring the obvious. And so we discussed in the past, what is the difference between the visibility and the non-visibility? And we find that there's a spectrum of visibility. And this spectrum of visibility falls within a certain range of wavelengths and a certain range of frequencies. And as such, we have specific dimensions, which we call colors. And each of them has a kind of range. And is at the center of this range, what we call the focal point, that we have described these colors. So we have a rainbow that goes from red to blue. And when we look at an actual rainbow in the sky, we find that the blue is on the inside and the red is on the outside. And we have discovered already that the speed of light is constant. And so what we're looking at is different colors of light. So in order for the speed of light to be constant, then as the ratio changes, then as the wavelength changes, the frequency has to change because the ratio needs to be constant. And so when you look at the wavelength, you find as you go from the blue to the red, the wavelength gets larger. But as you go from the blue to the red, the frequency gets smaller. So this is how the speed of light remains constant. So you find that gravitationally, being on the inside is the blue. Magnetically on the outside is red. And so we discussed this in the past also. So our point of view on Earth is from our point of view, not the Earth's point of view. It's our point of view on Earth that is our Earth view. In other words, within us is our antimatter, and what we see is the light matter. But when we look at a double rainbow, and we look closely at the sequence of colors, we find that it's reversed. The blue is on the outside. The red is on the inside. Oh, so I can see the second rainbow, but the second rainbow is a reflection of the first rainbow. One could argue that the second rainbow is the first rainbow, and the inside rainbow is the reflection. You could argue that. And then we could say, well, wait a second. If inside the smaller rainbow, we can see the light, and outside of the larger rainbow, the double rainbow, we can see the light, then in between is the dark state, the dark matter, and there is no light. And we know, according to the frequencies, that in the invisible spectrum below red is the infrared, and above the blue is the ultraviolet. And so these are invisible to the regular eye. And then, of course, you throw in the aura, which only a few people can see, and most of us can't see. And so that is also invisible. So where in this matrix here is everything organized? So fundamentally, we see that our earth state becomes the matter state. And then beyond the second rainbow is the outer space. But this is where the error comes in, because in order to see the light, and let's talk about the earth light, which is gravitational. And so when we look at the convergence, the blue convergence, that's gravitational. If we can see the red convergence, that's also gravitational. How can the blue convergence be gravitational and the red convergence be gravitational? And the reason is both are in the light matter state, because it's light, you can see the light. It's in between that is the dark matter. Well, if the relationship between the light matter, the dark matter, and the transition to the antimatter has a sequence, can it maintain that sequence in the same dimension? Not really, because the earth side is in the light, and outside the second rainbow is also in the light. And the in-between is the dark matter. So what you have is the light matter sandwiching the dark matter. So really the antimatter disappears. So now you have the matter plasma disappearing into the outer space, and you have the earth matter disappearing into your inner space, you, the inner one. Well, you now disappeared on both sides. You completely vanished. You have vanished. The antimatter has vanished. And this is supposedly our point of view. So now what we're talking about is the difference between the feeding and the feedback system. So nature is teaching us what the feeding is and how it works. And do we accept that? Can we explain that? Does it make sense? Or is our feedback limited in some way? So let's put it this way. What we see, what we touch, and what we feel is our feedback system. And so in this example, the inside rainbow is a feedback system. The outside rainbow is a feedback system. The in-between must be the feeding system. And this feeding system is operating in a different dimension. So now when we talked about what's going on in outer space, and we say, well, there's nothing there. Well, we've already discovered that the PM ticks are there. And the PM ticks are magnetical. So now we can say, well, it's the PM ticks that are feeding. And what is the rest of it? All the rest of it is the feedback. We've been through this panel before. So the plasmagen conversion is the balance between the feeding and the feedback system. And so it doesn't matter where you are, whether it's discussing antimatter, dark matter, mattergen, or the Magrav condition, or even the field interaction point. There is always a default position. There's always a default feeding position, the factory reset. And this factory reset is what we see that determines our transmission and our transition, which we've discussed as the fields of rotation and the fields with polarity. And as we go through these various dimensions, we always seem to have to fudge something, right? It's never precise. And so we find that when we look at the mathematical equation of pi, we always find that it's 3 and a bit. And that bit, we can't seem to define it. But it's always precise. We know that because our emotions show that we have accurate target shooting. And we know that our soul dimensions go through various geometries. And the basic geometries that we understand with basic science and basic math, and it doesn't even have to be basic science, it could be carpentry or engineering or pothole fillings. We can go from 2 dimensions and we can go from 3 dimensions, but there's always that little bit, that little thing that we have to fudge. There's always something that is causing the relationship between the scientific community and the spiritual community. There's always something that is missing. And that what is missing is the plasma science. This is why we say the plasma science adds to the knowledge. And what is the rate of change? Well, we're going to discuss that next week. But this week, when we're looking at the plasma, we see that somehow, some way, it transmutates into a field strength. And that field strength gives us a direction of flow and strength of flow. And so the basic field is a plasma, but the interaction between plasmas is a dynamic interaction. And so this is representative of energy in motion. So we say that, well, the energy in motion seems to add up. So there's a feeding and there's a feedback. The net result is an addition of the feeding plus the feedback. This is your synergy. What kind of feedback are you getting? That's your susceptibility. And so there's a relationship reference, a reference between the feeding and the feedback. And when the feedback system is messed up, then we can always fall back to the default position and transcend back to the original feeding factory setting. And we can do that within any range that we choose. So in other words, we can choose that within the Earth range. We can choose that within the outer space range. And we can also tune that to our plasma range. And we know that because we have created the GANs, and that is our feedback system. And when you're looking at the GANs in this bottle, what you're not seeing is the original physical GANs bottle. You're only seeing the product. And within that product, there's a hole. And it's not there, it's gone, it's vanished. And something in there has fed into that. And that's why we say, is there a soul in that hole? The plasma rule is that the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. It's feeding. It's a higher strength. What does the plasma rule not say? The higher strength abuses the weaker strength. The higher strength feeds back from the weaker strength. The feedback that the higher strength gets from the weaker strength is the success or failure of the feeding, the quality of the feeding. So when we talk about quality, quality is a generic term, like a car. It doesn't tell you whether it's good quality or bad quality. So if you know the basic rule and then you look at the result, then you can determine it. And this is what you need to do. You need to be able to determine it. You need to be able to determine this through the basic feedback. And the basic feedback comes from the creation of the universe. The universe is created from energy. And because this energy is always in motion, it is always positive. It is always giving. It is only the direction that changes. And so the direction is the charge. And so dependent on which dimension you're talking about, and it's not 2 dimensions, because the picture on the cover of book number 1 is 2 dimensions. And it's not 3 dimensions because now you're looking at the field. But because you are none of these 3 dimensions, and you are in the 4th dimension. And if that is you, what is feeding you? What is your default position? And is your position solely determined by what the feedback is? Or can you connect to your default position so that you can discern if your feedback is a limited feedback or an unlimited feedback? And not being able to discern this is this point of conflict. And so if you understand this, and so when you define the direction of energy and you see how that comes together, and you say, well, we have a situation, and that situation is exposing a dereliction of duty, and that's not important, that creates conflict. And that conflict is a representation of energy in motion. And energy in motion, whether it's a feeding system or whether it's a feedback system, is based on magnetical field forces of attraction and repulsion. Doesn't get simpler than that. But it's from a point. And that point is a magraph where you have a magnetical gravitational balance. It is from that point that we can do a natural creation or a natural decay. But if a natural decay is based on a loss of energy, then we could say that an emission is a giving of energy and it is a loss of energy. But isn't it interesting that an emission is a natural creation? So the natural decay then becomes an absorption of energy. Well, if you're absorbing energy, then how can you decay? So now you have to understand that in the process of the decay, what you've done fundamentally is you've taken a neutron and broken it down into an electron-proton combination. Part of that decay process is the release of these PM ticks. And so whether these PM ticks are in the process of decay or in the process of creation, they operate the same way. It's just that they go in opposite directions. So the creation is natural, and the opposite reaction is a natural decay. But through the process of natural decay, it becomes another kind of natural creation. And so to understand this, we have this non-visible connection in between these two, which we call the bonding fudge factor, because we can't see it and we can't explain it, but somehow this is all coming together. And so we discussed the covalent bond, which doesn't show the anchor, doesn't show the rope, doesn't show the chain, but it does show the connection. And so if we look at the higher strength feeding the weaker strength, the higher strength is gravitational. Well, how could the gravitational, if it's absorbing energy, be giving? Well, there you go. Now you know the difference between the feeding and the feedback and how the two go together. And so we find that that anomaly where cells multiply through division, and when we talk about the radar love, what is the default? What is the default connection? And is it limited by our feedback? So when we look at the cups of life, they're not just for the pandemic. They are the cups of life, because part of our life has to do with the emotional context. So we designed one cup, which has a magnetical gravitational field relationship. And we designed a second cup, which is physical. And if we want to use those for specific purposes, when you're making the GANs, keep these at least 1 meter apart. And is that important today as it was 2 years ago? You betcha. You betcha, because we are still dysfunctional. One of the dividends of the pandemic is that we see what works and what doesn't work. And so what does work is we brought in different ganses and we were able to create water. And in the process, we were able to create peace. Peace with what? Peace with our soul, peace with our environment, and peace with the interaction of all of those conditions. Because when two forces come together, there is a universal harvesting that enhances. But the way we've been operating on this planet is self-consuming. And this is very destructive, especially when you get into loose harvesting, because it steals the essence of the soul. And so these become points of conflict. And so anything beyond that is a feedback of a conflict resolution. But if you don't understand how these forces come together and what happens as a result, because it doesn't just disappear, you maybe can't see it and you say, well, it disappears, but it can't go anywhere. There's no anywhere to go. It all goes to the same spot. So it has to go somewhere else. And so now we better understand, or we are in a better position to understand, that the speed of rotation of the plasma of the electron is dictated by the amount of these magnetic fields. And these fields are transferred. And so we transfer them from a large twin plasma of the proton to the smaller twin plasma of the electron. This is a fundamental feeding system. And you can't make a mistake, because it has to go somewhere. So you have to trust that wherever it's going is going based on a reason. And if it's not you, and if it's not your feedback system, then it must be this feeding system, because the transmutation is a crossover of this vanishing point. And this crossover is between the plasma reality and the physical reality. And our inability to cross over these two realities is placing a limitation on our souls. And so we have to identify, what is it? What is it that we're doing that is feeding? And so, yeah, we can feed from the physical state, but the feeding from the physical state is actually a feedback. To what? It's a feedback to our plasmatic state. As a result of that feedback, the plasmatic state is feeding back. And so there's a give and a take, and it goes back and forth, but not in the same dimension. So the truth of it is based on the matter plasma default. So there's a dominant matter state, and that dominant matter state is the matter plasma default. And that default is the common denominator in all of us, because we all come from the same source. So if you take away the limitations of the plasma feedback, you can't go wrong. You always hit the target. And so the PM ticks that feed the Magrav condition comes from a composite of various plasma charges, and they all dilute into a field. And the strength of the field is determined by the gradient charge. And the strength of this field and the creation of this field comes from the aminogen structure, which is the precursor to the amino acid structure of the plasma, of the physical state. And this is what contributes to the spice of life, because we're over 7 billion and we all have a common denominator. And the thing is, regardless of our feedback system, which is physically dependent, we can all go to sleep and we all go into a dream state. And so our dream has an energy state. And we find that there's an indomitable spirit that all of us carry. But the strongest one is the one that defaults to the spirit of the soul. The soul pack. The soul pack is the default energy pack. And so the difference between our 5-cup stacker and our universal cup is the basic transfer from the dynamic transfer state to the physical destination state. And so the balancing of the feeding system and the feedback system, and that we're all trying to learn, is target practice. And that target practice needs to be accurate, because our feeding needs to be accurate. And how can you be accurate when there are limitations? So this is where we start to define the manifestation. Our perception of reality when two fields come together. Any formation is a manifestation. And the plasma feeding is what leads to this manifestation. So that you can understand that if this manifestation is either non-tangible or tangible, or non-visible or visible, or plasmatic or physical, then the truth and the integrity of the reality, regardless whether it's a plasmatic reality or a physical reality, is dependent on the balance between the feeding and the feedback system. So this manifestation becomes a form artifact of that manifestation. I'm sorry, this manifestation becomes a form artifact of that truth in the reality. And the truth of that reality comes from the impetus, from the insight that we gain from our physical presence and our default connection. And so the emotion of presence is this connection to energy and motion. And what we have is the form artifact of the successful connection. And that is not the only factor, as this is only an interim class. It's an interim class to identify and understand better the conversion of the MAGRAV feeding. So if we absorb more energy, we bring energy in, and we bring more in through the process of absorption. This is called the gravitational. And if from there we can give energy and give more, that is called magnetical or emission. And we can do this in physical reality, physical dimension, and we can do this in a plasma reality and a plasma dimension. And if that is the case, then we have to go outside. And so today we're only talking about the inside. The inside is you. And this is your default point of view, because you see what you see. And are you able to compare that to what you need to see? So the things that you can't see disappear across the vanishing point. And if the only thing that you can see is the emotional conversion and the manifestation into the physical, then you can see how you have not only limited your point of view, but imposed artificial limitations on your feedback system. It's incomplete and it's contrived. And so how do you decide? how do you decide what is normal? And how do you reset everything to go back to the default factory setting? Well, first of all, it's very normal. The majority of us are normal. And the majority of us seek freedom and emancipation. That's what's important. And that's what's in our tiny world. And that's what's important. But when you look at the universe, which is much bigger, you find that the universe is normal. And the Earth, being part of that universe, is also seeking freedom and emancipation. So that is what's normal. And then we realize there's a soul sequencing. This is the feeding system. The soul of the sun plus the soul of the earth attracts the soul of the man. So once you've established that, there's a new feeding. So the soul of the earth plus the soul of the man attracts the soul of the body. And now you have a new feeding system. The soul of the earth plus the soul of the body manifests physically, manifests the body. So what you now have is another manifestation of a pathway, the default pathway that you trusted to get here in the first place, the original factory setting. So now you understand what the vision enhancement system is doing. This is our gift to the US military for PTSD recovery. It's defining the default pathway manifestation through the soul enhancement and spirit enhancement to soothe the pain of the witness. And this can only be done through a plasma interaction between the factory default setting and the earthbound feedback setting. There are other default angels that we could rely on. And we will be talking more about the vertical enhancement units and the horizontal enhancement units. And so we have to find that the role of man is not the condemnation. The fact that it's man-made is not the condemnation. It's the inability to work together with the universal feeding system, because too many of us are witnesses to this self-consumption, which is at the expense of others. And yes, we need to have this binding system, but do we have to do this with killing through competition and through trophies? And if that is our form artifact that we choose, then the default pathway disappears. However, we all suddenly are becoming witness to this vanishing point of change. And we know that. We know that because we know that we have a conditional feedback that involves, shall we say, terrorism, and we have an unconditional feedback that involves the trust in the Creator. And if you remove these conditional feedbacks, what is the default? The default is to the original factory setting of the Creator. And we said that rate of change will be sudden, but not only. So when we look at the essentials for life, and you see that, well, you know, maybe we should be fixing some potholes. Honestly, on the top 10 list of things that I need to do, fixing potholes is not on the top of the list. Not in the top 10 anyway. But air, water, food, and the quality of the air, water, and food, the good quality of the air, water, and food, and shelter, these are essentials for life. These are the foundations for a high quality of life. And the feeders on this planet provide these essentials. And terrorists deny these essentials. So if you're undecided, if you're a feeder or a terrorist, you have to ask yourself, well, what is your default position? So let's look at Pareto's principle. This is the 80-20 rule. Do you all know that? The 80-20 rule is where 20% of the people do all the work and 80% of the people watch. But it's also a feeding ratio that we've discovered where 20% of the energy that we get from our food, no, check that. 20% of the energy that we get is from our food. The other 80% comes from the plasma energy of the universe. So realistically, the feedback system is actually only 20% of our feeding. And yet, in that feedback, 20% of the people work at that feedback system to feed the other 80%. So the essentials of life that we're all working towards only accounts for 20% of what we need. So we now have artificial default limits. But you could say that maybe 20% of the people do 80% of the work, and that 20% of the work doesn't get done. And so now we know why we have a bit of a problem here, because we're all free to make our choices. And so what we find is that by attracting ourselves to the weaker field forces, we limit our ability to feed ourselves back. And so we're not asking ourselves what is our default position, and we're not asking ourselves how we know. But there is one thing that we do know, that if we don't have the essentials of life, whether you're a terrorist or you're in need, it's the same position. When you don't have the essentials for life, then life becomes an existential crisis. But interestingly enough, if we spend most of our life providing the essentials of life, what would happen if that 20% suddenly was not necessary in terms of what we do with our life? What would happen if we were able to tap in to our default position, our factory setting? What would happen if we learned how to trust that? And how would that change your default position? And how would you know if it was correct? You just have to look at creation and understand what is missing in your life. And if your life is not based on ethics, which involves morality, compassion, and courage, and say you substitute these for something else, and what would be the obvious substitute? Well, didn't we already talk about that? Didn't we already talk about what's impressive? What impresses you is the amount of money that you have so that you could buy the expensive toys and so that you can demonstrate your beneficence. But you see, we all go into this dream state, and in this dream state, we try and make this basic connection to our default position. And so what we find is that when we create this peace stone, the energy within this peace stone and the energy within our dream state is the same. It is the same, because when you wake up within your own body. There's a connection. That connection is strong. But where did that energy for that connection come from? There has to be a default setting from the factory, and we're connected to that. And that is what's beyond the dream state. And you know this is true because something unseen, non-visible, non-tangible is causing all of these souls to cross the bridges of knowing. How are they making that decision? How do they know they're making the right decision? Are they making the right decision? They are the judge, right? They are the judge because they're knowing by connection. They know if they're right. And they know that they're right because they're doing something based on an unseen connection. And so the connection to the outer space from the earth space, there actually is an in-between space, the plasmagen state. And so this plasmagen state is literally the inner space. But this inner space is in an unseen dimension. So we could say that what we are doing is beyond the vanishing point. And we have an opportunity to dematerialize or materialize. So the physical state is not the destination state. Wherever you are, that's where you are. And so whether you're in the plasma state or in the physical state, that is your destination. And the reason that your destination is secure is if you maintain that connection to your default factory setting. So literally, there is an outer space and there is an inner space. And this explains the relationship between the physical science, the spiritual science, and the plasma science. So there's a connection between the feeding and the feedback system that is unconditional. And it's because of this unconditional aspect of it that we don't need to be directly next door to have a connection. We can have a contiguous connection. It's the universal contiguous connection. because it's connected to the factory default setting. And you always have that opportunity. And the Universal Council is not dependent on the environment. So it shows you the connection that they have with everything. It's a Universal Council. It's not an Earth-bound council. It's not a space-bound council. So we have a connection to the greater oneness. And what is this greater oneness and how do we connect to it? Well, we don't choose. We have an opportunity to spread out, to diverge and transcend. And so this movement is a residue. It's a magnetical residue from a point of Maggrav condition, which is the balance between the gravitational and magnetical field forces. The gravitational field forces which converge and the magnetical field forces which diverge. And then you have really is the basic magnetical field forces of attraction and repulsion. And so you find that each one as an independent variable can reach one in an interdependent universe, and as such can teach one through an emotional transformation, but not only, because this is how we connect one nation, one planet, and one universe. And we know that because there is a follow-up to the Freedom Convoy that I can report, because the Freedom Convoy has exposed this default position. The success of the Freedom Convoy was based on a solid, rock-solid foundation: freedom, peace, and love. These are the feeding systems for the plasma. And the feeding system dividend that was derived from the Freedom Convoy is the difference between the constitutional rights in Canada, which is a conditional feedback, and the Bill of Rights, which is an unconditional feeding. What's the difference, you say? The constitutional rights abdicate your responsibility and pass it on to man-made law. The Bill of Rights embraces the universal law under God. The default pathway has been exposed. And this is the plasma science as presented by the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute, calling all Earth patriots, both near and far. We need the World Peace Treaty. That's the default. Sign it. Sign it with a pen. Sign it with your heart. Sign it with your emotions, and sign it with your soul. Because the physical and emotional transformation that we keep talking about depends on the source and the balance of the feeding and the feedback systems. Our default position is to listen to the universal language of freedom. And that's why plasma science needs to be delivered in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the outer space age, and we will carry on with the intermediate insight more next week. That's the end of the lesson. Thank you so much.
Alex?
Good day, sir.
Yeah, John here. It's interesting you were touching the problem between the constitutional rights and I forget the other term you used.
Bill of
But
Rights.
have you got to know about the new WHO constitution that's over all the countries?
So, John, I'm not in a commentary situation or,
Fine.
that's why I don't want to talk about that.
But we've all got to have to look into it because you've got 18
Well,
months to get out of it.
Not in this forum. No. We have a target date to deliver the plasma science, and the plasma science is connected to our default position. So that's what we're teaching here, and that's what this forum is all about. So, I mean, thank you for bringing that up, but this is not the forum to discuss it.
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for another beautiful teaching. So many things to contemplate in different positions, and I'm sure we all have different takes on it, but very beautiful and wide ranging, let's say. Usually we ask, and maybe Alex needs to warm his tea for a moment or two. We usually ask, is there anyone here for the first time who would like to tell us who you are and where you're from? And if not, then we'll go back to questions with Alex or anything anyone wants to bring up here regarding his teaching or any other points related to the Keshe Foundation. So is there anyone here for the first time that hasn't been here before in this meeting? It was interesting. I was thinking of Dor yesterday and the day before, and now I see him appear in this meeting. Very interesting. But anyone else who hasn't been here before, this is your first time visiting us, maybe you can tell us your name and how you found the meeting. We have a number of UC members here. I see Stefanian, Shweta, Ador, Kitan. So thank you for joining as well. Okay, not hearing anything. Is there anyone who would like to bring up something about what we just heard from Alex? Or perhaps share your understanding?
Mark, can you hear me, Mark?
Yes, Shweta,
Hello?
very clearly.
Thank you so much, my dear Mark. Thank you. Thank you, my dear Alex, for all your unconditional love you always give all of us. And as you said, the feedback is the blessing of the mother. I will say, because we are peacekeepers, we are peace lovers, we are messenger of peace. So this is the feedback, my dear one, that the mother gives the blessing of the Shambhala within all of us to be together always in this way. There is a shloka, ancient shloka from the Vedas I have taken, as the mother was blessing the children of Shambhala to be prosperous, peaceful, and in abundance, with no suffering, peace, light, and love. And this, I will read this shloka. This is the meaning, what mother's blessing is. Sarve Sham. This is called Shri. Shri means in India, beauty and totality. Sarve Sham Shanti Bhavatu. Sarve Bhavatu Sukhinaha. Sarve Sham Purna Bhavatu. Sarve Sham Ganganam Bhavatu. Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha. Sarve Santu Niramaya. Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu. Ma Kachidam Dukha Bhaga Bhave. This also means that see the truth, see the beauty. It is from within you. The Shambhala is. Come, children of Shambhala, be in this beauty and totality. So this is the blessing of the mother and the Happy New Year, the Happy New Year era we are in. That is the beauty. And what I can say, Thank you, my dear. This is the feedback from a knowledge seeker, a lover. Thank you so much. Happy New Year to all. Sarve Sukhina Santu. Sarve Shanti Santu. Peace will be. Peace it is. Thank you so much. And salam, namaste, salute, beautiful souls. Thank you, Mar. You always give us the opportunity to say something. Thank you so much, my dear.
Thank you, Shweta, and we're looking forward to joining you in your native homeland there soon for some of these meetings as well.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
We're looking forward to that. Happy Nowruz to everyone here and beyond. This marks the day of the Persian New Year. And that's what that word Nowruz apparently means, Mr. Kesh said, a new day. So thank you, Galib. Is there anything you'd like to share? We did see the table and how it was set. Mr. Kesh did give an explanation about that, and he was hoping that the agreements would be signed because there was going to be large fireworks celebrations. And Iran has gotten a very good agreement, I think Mr. Kesh said as well, even more than they were expecting. So very beautiful, and thank you, Kesh Foundation. And all those who've elevated the 5+1 negotiations. As Mr. Kesh said, there were thousands and thousands of people there from various countries. It's not only the negotiators or the leaders, perhaps, or their representatives, but all their support teams. So many people have became elevated, I think, out of these meetings. And of course, we're not going to stop there, as Mr. Kesh said. It's just not elevating them to peace. There'll be more and more work through our soul level. Which again, the beauty of working through the soul is that no one fails. So it's not like you have to go to classes for 5 years or 1 year or understand this or that. You give unconditionally from your soul. And no one fails this test. And again, you can do it with any being, any entity, I believe. So we need to start practicing this more and more, because it's the soul of the collective awareness. By giving will create that position of change. And that doesn't mean giving money or clothes or food. It means giving from your essence, from your fields, to elevate the others. And I think it's very easy. It doesn't cost any money. And actually, by elevating the others, you become more elevated in a certain way. Don't understand exactly how it works, but it works. So would anyone like to ask Alex a question? Are we really connected to this planet, Alex, or do we just think we're connected? We daydream sometimes during the day. Maybe you're looking at the sun and you'd wonder what it would be like to be there, or another position in the universe. We dream at night. Our soul takes our soul of physicality, or maybe not all the time, but sometimes. I know Mr. Kesh said you could ask the soul to take the soul of physicality with it. So are we really connected to this planet, or do we just think we are? And maybe by thinking we're not so connected here would allow us to travel a bit easier? I don't know if anyone would want to address that. Does that hold us, our thoughts of being connected? Would it hold us down more, do you think?
Well, no, it does hold us down, but, you know, that is a manifestation of our free will. When we came here, it was because we wanted to. But, you know, the first question that comes to mind is, you know, when did you decide that you wanted to? So if your only decision-making capability is within your consciousness, then the decision-making was done in your unconsciousness. So the you, if you say that the you is your spiritual you, well, that is part of your physical context, because your spiritual you feeds your physical context. But your soul is also a feeding system. And so not only, so the other plasma souls are also part of a feeding system. And not only, so all the plasma systems really have the same default. And so the reason that we're having a problem here is that for some of us, and you could say, 20% of us have decided to disconnect the factory reset. We're going to make our own reset, right? Our reset is better than the factory reset, but what I'm saying is that the factory reset is an unconditional feeding, whereas the man-made reset is a conditional feedback. And so there's a conditional motive. And that conditional motive is on the natural desire of the feeder. But the thing is that the natural desire of the feeder is compromised by the exclusion of the benefits to the others. That's not the way the universe works. So on the one hand, as a feeder, you're, in line with the universal feeding system, but then you've modified it for your own personal gain. But in the same process, you've limited your personal gain to this physical feeding system. And so you've disconnected from the plasma feeding system. And as more and more of that 20% become aware, you find that the 20% who are doing 80% of the work, but that 80% of the work is in the freedom suppression, is in the censorship, is in the work that is done to limit the feedback. So at what point are they the ones who are limiting the feedback, or are they the ones who are enhancing the feedback? Because what is the criteria for you to be part of either system? So in the one system, the criteria is the financial gain. In the other system is the soul enhancement and the freedom and emancipation of the soul. So you have the choice. Did you know that you had the choice? Well, what happens when you find out? When you find out that you have the choice and you say, well, up until now, I only had the one choice, and I was really, really happy with that choice because I benefited. And I don't care about you, okay? That's your problem. I'm fixing the pothole because my car gets damaged. And if your car drives over the fixed road and doesn't get damaged, well, that's just your good fortune. But it has nothing to do with my intention, because my intention is for my intention. And that's the limiting of the feedback. So the only way that you can impose this limitation of the feedback is to deny the default factory setting. And that's the point of what I was trying to say today. Because the existential crisis that each of us has is based on this default factory setting, because that is what the default factory setting is. It is for life wanting to live. So whether you're a provider or whether you're a terrorist, you still want to live. It's the same thing. So what differentiates you from being a provider or being a terrorist? What? The amount of money that you make? And what we've seen is how that money can be easily confiscated. Oh, so you're making a decision based on a contrived feedback system. And you are putting everything on the line for that. Do you really think that that's a good decision? Do you really think that that's what's important? And do you have insurance? Do you have insurance that the feeding system that you have picked is the guaranteed feeding system? Do you have that insurance? If your insurance is provided by the undependable source, why would you choose an undependable source? Because you like the thrill of gambling? What's wrong with the rock solid choice, the universal feeding system, the default factory setting? A life wants to live, and life wants to live in peace and harmony and freedom and enjoy the love that is derived from that. Why are we debating that? And if there's a deficiency in our knowledge, then we are exposing that deficiency. And so hopefully through these classes, it's my contribution to trying to clarify that, you know, the Knowledge Seekers workshops on Thursday are plowing a path, and they're going at a rate that is far faster than what we're going at here. So if you look at the two together, and maybe from a different point of view, you can see, hey, wait a second. Every energy level, every energy state is connected to the default factory position. So how does that change the rules of the game for you? And so you have to become more skillful in making these decisions. And that's what's happening to each and every one of us on this planet. And so you find that the 1% who are dependent on the 20% to keep the 80% enslaved are in a very frightful position. And you can see that by the desperation, where a pothole repair carries the same weight and importance as a very active and heated military exchange on this planet. It's out of proportion, it's out of whack, and it's a sign of desperation. And so if that gives you a clue, then you can make your choice on which factory setting you wish to connect to and which one you wish to ignore. Over to you, Mark.
Right. In the universe, there's no insurance either, I don't think. And these energy packs, apparently this prana, this energy could affect you in maybe a negative way. Do these energy packs have souls? You're talking about the stronger feeding the weaker. And I know it was talked about, we'd have to be very careful with these energy packages that we're going to meet or come in proximity to, or maybe try to avoid. I don't see why they would want to take a weaker energy.
So it's just like,
It's almost the same as down here in a way.
well, it is. It is. It's just like saying car. Is it a Ferrari or is it a beater? You don't know. All right, so there has to be a way to discern that. And the thing is that an important criteria that you have to determine? And so the thing is because the soul is connected to the creator, then that is the true connection. That is beyond doubt. That is, beyond questioning. And every time you need to have a confirmation, and we are in spring in the Northern Hemisphere. And so you will see, the grass is greener, the trees develop leaves, and the plants grow. And this is what happens. And nature does that because nature, fortunately, doesn't listen to us. We are just part of nature.
Right, it seems like we're going to have to develop some systems to drain these energies if we go in a certain place and pick up something. It's almost like being here. You go make sure your doors are locked at times and windows are closed. But space also has some, I don't want to say dangers to it, but apparently there's even energies that could take your own soul if you're not knowledgeable about it. So there's more to it than just traveling in the environment out there. There's a lot of interactions going on the energy level.
But this energy level is not just on the physical level, you see. So, if you only depended on your physical feedback system, then if you go to sleep at night, you literally have to sleep with one eye open, right? Because if that's the only system that you have that you can depend on. So there are other systems that we can depend on and we do depend on. And we just have to be aware that, we have that capability. So, if your feedback system says, hey, you know what, I've got all these bombs dropping around me, you don't need to figure out that, you're in danger. But if these dangers are not visible, then for most of us, it's distilled down to suspicion. I have this gut feeling that something is wrong. I can't quite put my finger on it. Well, because it's not a physical feeling, right? It's a physical manifestation of an emotional feeling. So how do you put your finger on an emotional feeling? And you can't. But you have to have a trust in it. Well, if you have a trust in something that you can't feel, that's like being grounded in the middle of nowhere. So are you up? Are you down? Are you backwards? Are you upside down? Where are you? Okay. So the physical relationship is not the only relationship. And it takes a lot to understand this. Why? Because 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we are told what is important. And so we find that so-and-so has a fashion malfunction. And then so-and-so has 100 people died in an explosion. And these two things gain the same kind of importance within our daily psyche. You've got to be kidding, really?
Alex, I need to step away for a minute. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. I need to check something.
So
I'll be
I'll
right back.
carry on.
Please carry on. Everyone else, thank you.
I'm hoping that I'm making a connection here, like with respect to this connection, because this connection is based on trust. So the verification and validation of that trust is really what it boils down to. And you know, how can you trust? And especially when the track record is so undependable. And so your basic goal and your basic, shall we say, default position is to trust. However, as we become more skillful in our discernment, then you don't just listen to the words, you listen to the intention behind the words. And you say, well, how can I physically listen to the intention? No, you can physically listen to the acoustic manifestation of the intention. But there's more than that. If I were to draw that into an example, say musically, they describe some music with a certain kind of timbre, a certain kind of resonance, or a certain kind of harmony. And you find that these characteristics are beyond the physical hearing range. And so these that are beyond the physical hearing range affects how you feel towards this music when you hear it. So in other words, you can have two people singing the same song identically with the same notes and the same inflections, but you would be judgmental in that for sure. And you say, well, so-and-so is better than the other. But what happens if both of them have the true intentions of emoting the true emotions? You would say, well, yeah, that one is better, but they were both great. So the feedback that you're giving, you don't have to say that that's great, because they know their intentions. I had that same experience with a lie detector test. The police officer asked me if I would mind waiting to have the results from the lie detector test. And I said, hello, stupid, talking to him. It's a lie detector test. I passed, okay, I'm leaving. Oh, he says, please humor me. So I had to wait. And he comes back and he says, I have good news for you. You passed the lie detector test. You know what? I didn't need his confirmation. Why did he think he needed to give me his confirmation? He needed the confirmation.
Okay, I'm back. Good thing it wasn't your brother-in-law reading the test.
Yeah. So, you know, that's where, you know, the truth wins out. And so, you know, when your believability is challenged, and I think all of us are challenged in this plasma science. That's why we are devoting so much time to it. But you know what? We are challenged in our belief system, but we are investing the time in trying to analyze this and trying to discern the difference. And so, you know, the thing is that this is not a an opinion segment. This is not a journalistic exercise. This is not entertainment. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm not here to entertain me. So my responsibility is to convey something to you to make your time investment worthwhile. And I don't need your opinion to determine if what I'm giving you is worthwhile. I sincerely believe that what I was presenting today is worthwhile. That's the truth. So that's why I'm here. But it doesn't depend on whether you think it's worthwhile. The only thing that is dependent on you thinking that it's worthwhile is your attendance. But guess what? You may only, let's say may, you may only make that decision based on your physical interpretation and say, oh, you know, that was a good singer. And then next thing you know, somewhere down the road, you're humming this tune. And you say, wait a second, he wasn't that good a singer. Why am I singing this song? And when you come out with the answer, you'll find that that made a connection to you. And you know, we find that, for instance, for some of us, a song may remind us of a nostalgic time in our past, or maybe we were with someone who we really enjoyed their company. And so this song reminded you of that. And that could be the thing. But what happens if, you know, maybe you hear a song that you've never heard before? Maybe a song, are the songs that were written from the time that you were born, are those the only songs that you've ever heard? Maybe you heard some songs when you were in the womb of your mother. And what happens then? Were no songs written before you entered the womb of your mother? I know that there are songs because I hear the recordings from before I was born. And how far back does that go? And so there are some people who say, you know what, my calendar only goes back, 5,000 some odd years. Anything that's before that, well, that's no, never mind. Well, no, never mind cuts you off from the factory setting, from the factory default setting, doesn't it? Because the factory default setting doesn't just include you. It includes the vertical people, the horizontal people, the planets, the solar system, the galaxy, and the universe. And this is what we're trying to grapple with on, with this intermediate insight class. But, take a peek into the future. What is a universe? It's a singular universe. It's a singular universe. Are you sure? Are you sure there isn't a multiverse? Are you sure that there isn't a magnetical universe and a gravitational universe? And what is our role playing in that? So, what's important? We all have our choices. But the thing is, regardless of our physical confirmation, and that is our affirmation of our environment. And I want to directly answer your question, Mark. We came here for a purpose, because life is not without purpose. And we didn't come to Mars, and we didn't come to Jupiter. We came to Earth. So our existence on Earth is drawn by the interaction between the soul of the sun and the soul of the earth. And that made a connection with our soul. And so the soul of the sun, the soul of the earth, and our soul has a default factory connection to the soul of the creator. And what we're realizing right now is that we have some kind of deficiency, and it is this deficiency that has allowed this kind of hooliganism to carry on this planet. And how do you feel about that? Well, it all depends on if you're the persecutor or the persecuted, doesn't it? But regardless, you have to figure out, and all of us have to figure it out, what defines you to be the persecutor and what defines you to be the persecuted. And is that eternal? So in other words, you're on the winning team, but all you have to look at is our entertaining sports, and you find that teams trade players. And so you may find yourself on the losing team. And how would you like them, Marcos? So the position that you have is temporary. And this is exactly the message that Mr. Kesh is trying to give. If your position is temporary, then what are you fighting for? So we're fighting for the essentials of life. Well, what happens if the universe provides all the essentials of life for you? Then do you need to fight at all? Because the whole basis of the conflict is to deny the essentials of life, isn't it? So the whole reason for the existence is null and void, gone, vanished. So now what happens? Now there's a vacuum in the emotional context of the physicality. Well, that's because of an overcompensation to the physical manifestation. And so there needs to be an adjustment, a feedback, right? There needs to be a feedback. So the message today is that we understand a physical feedback. We have to understand the emotional feedback. I think that's easy enough. You support your sports team scores, you are happy. The sports team is happy. They feed, you feedback, and your feedback allows them to feedback again. So you understand the emotional feedback. Well, guess what? There has to be a soul feedback as well. And this is the breakthrough in the plasma science. It's a done deal. It's finished. Past tense. The future and the past is in the present. That's the point. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, I forgot how I got here. But I think we're going to be allowed to remember down the road at some point how we made all these transmutations and subdivisions and traveled away from the creator, let's say. But we're going to be allowed to remember some of these things, I think, in the future. And maybe it won't seem such where you think you'll miss the physicality or something when you go back into the energy state, but now we're finding out we can actually exist in both dimensions. So there's a lot going on in the background, so much we're not even aware of. As he said previously, there's thousands of steps in this ladder, not even counting the different dimensions in all these steps. So this a tremendous amount of knowledge to be shared, to be understood, to be used, I guess, to elevate others. And that's what it's all about. And in doing that process, you elevate your own soul. But we always hear nobody wants to be the sacrificial lamb, so to speak. But that's, I guess that's when you reach the level of the creator, when you're a total giver. And just to allow the others to elevate. I don't understand it completely. I'm working on it like the rest. But we're very fortunate to be here. I mean, this is the only place you're going to hear about this knowledge. I mean, through yourself, Jalal, other teachers, the Kesh Foundation, this knowledge. So we should feel very privileged that we've even gotten the door open a little bit and started to peek inside this whole world of plasma and understanding fields and interactions and so on. For most men, women, it's just beyond their field strength at this point. But we've just been allowed to see it a little bit earlier than the others, I think Mr. Gesh said.
So Mark, on that note, I want to thank everybody for attending today's class and allowing me to present on behalf of the North American team and the international team. I just want to thank all of us for being present in the now. And we're looking for some serious changes because the countdown is on. And so I hope that we have more good news to offer next week. But always remember that the universe is a benevolent place. Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to come in? Thank you again, Alex. We do appreciate all your work and your understanding and sharing your knowledge unconditionally. I think Mr. Kesh was answering a question. He says, I know very little, but I share the little that I know. Is there anyone else who would want to bring a subject up in relation to the foundation or ask a question or something we can share? We don't want to make this a marathon. I was told these meetings are a little bit too long. There are 3 other little clips I'd like to play. The one on, is it Artemis, which is the new rocket system that NASA has ordered, probably in the billions and billions of dollars. But Mr. Kesh comments on this idea of developing both the plasma system and the rocket system together in a way, which was strange hearing that. But he said we shouldn't become arrogant and thinking our way is the only way to go. And then I'd like to play a part of a clip from Mernez about judging. And then we'll end up again with the understanding of the carbon-14 and the CO2 box. And I hope others will, if it's shared on other channels or in different ways, other people will hear certain things. Mr. Kesh has a way of speaking directly to you, but at the same time, speaking to the collective and even the universal community. So that's quite a skillful ability to do, and hopefully we able to do that in the future, all of us, that we can speak and interact with the soul of the people listening to us individually, as well as the collective, as well as the universal community. And that's quite a phenomenal place to be in a way. And that's why I guess they say the universal teachers are come from the depth of the soul of the creator. They have that ability to reach all, as he said, and I remember, just give me 1 hour per day for a week and I will change your nation. So that's how powerful these interactions with Mr. Keshe, as he says, he's a master of the teaching. Anyone else want to add anything else? I'm going to play these clips. They're all from the 424th Knowledge Seekers Workshop. So if you have to do something else, no problem at all. You can review it all. And we're just touching on a few of the highlights. He said people will be listening to these teachings for thousands of years. So how amazing is that? Hearing none, let's go to, thank you again, Alex, and everyone else for attending today. And we thank your souls for bringing you here.